Well, we're going to move forward here. It is not over yet. We've actually got two fantastic guests joining us to continue the conversation. We've got Mikaela Nhondo Erskog, who's an educator, researcher with Pan-Africanism Today, and also the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. And we also have back with us today Dr. Gerald Horne, who is the Morris Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston, among many other things. Mika and Gerald, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right?
I can definitely hear you all right, Mika, and I know it's also very late where you are, so thanks again for joining us. I want to ask you a question here, Mika, that I just have been, I don't know if it is a paradox. I don't know how to view it, but I've been thinking about it a lot over the past couple days. You know, looking at the TRIPS waiver issue in front of the World Trade Organization, you know, on the one hand, obviously South Africa and India are leading a valiant struggle to lift the intellectual property protections. But I did sort of glance briefly at some of the conversation around Freedom Day that celebrates the first free election in 1994 in South Africa. And from a lot of the unions and other social organizations, there were some pretty potent criticisms of not only how the government had dealt with COVID-19, but many other things. And it just felt like such a paradox that on the one hand, it's like, yes, the South African government is fighting in the WTO for the right thing. But then you look, it seems to not really be covering itself in glory on the home front. I just didn't know what to make of that.
Well, thanks, Eugene and Rania, and hi to Professor Gerald Horne. I'm really glad to be participating in this very important discussion. So there are a couple of things which I think are worth saying before we delve into some of the deep and miserable contradictions that the South African people and the African people are having to deal with, is that, number one, many of us on the left and trade unions, social movements, on the one hand, we do welcome the push by South Africa and India for this waiver of intellectual property rights, which would make significant strides in terms of vaccine production for countries that are largely relying on the COVAX, which we know is pretty much, inefficient and is not going to actually solve the issue. We welcome it on the one hand, but on the other hand, in the same way that we will be, criticizing Cyril Ramaphosa and the ruling party for the kind of continued decades of neoliberal policies that have totally impoverished and deprived the working class and the majority in South Africa, we can criticize them on the one hand about that, but simultaneously welcome the fact that, for example, Ramaphosa endorsed Cuba's Henry Reeve Medical Brigade to get the Nobel Peace Prize, which is an extremely important internationalist advocacy move, because they've done incredible work and shown what solidarity means in a moment in which, as Rania was saying, the US, the global north have been closing in on themselves, have been hoarding vaccines, have been, refusing to share knowledge, tech, productive capacities that essentially we as the working class of the world have generated and produced over decades, over centuries, right? So on the one hand, we very much support this waiver, which, for those who don't know, it's just in this particular situation. Many of us would want intellectual property rights to be waived across the board for all the kinds of things that humankind needs. This is in a situation in which Moderna, one of the big vaccine producers, is expected to make 18 billion this year in 2021, which is supposed to be the first time they're making profit in 11 years, right? Since their founding, wow. They've not made profit. And now they're going to make an estimated at least 18 billion this year. So on the one hand, we very much welcome this, and even a lot of us on the far left even push back against, I'm sure you guys have heard of Okonjo-Iweala, who's the new Director General of the World Trade Organization, the first African woman who's leading the charge, who even some of us, are pushing back against her kind of third way, where, she essentially wanted a middle ground of let's allow groups to actually volunteer their kind of licenses, that's the word, not legalities, licenses for manufacturing. And we completely disagree. We believe there has to be a full waiver of all intellectual property rights that will enable people of the world to be vaccinated, because we know that if we're not vaccinated everywhere, it's going to be a huge problem. And we've seen this in South Africa with the variants, the 501Y-V2, which as soon as we allow for variants of the strain to be developed, we are creating even greater issues, because we saw with AstraZeneca, we tried to buy a bunch of AstraZeneca early in the year and found that it's not very effective against the vaccine. And this, by the way, we were paying more than double of what a lot of European countries were paying for AstraZeneca. I think South Africa purchased it per dose. It was around $5 point something, whilst I think Europeans paid around $2. And part of their reasoning, they said, was that it was due to the fact that these European countries had contributed to the research and development, right? And this ignores the fact that, yes, this pre-purchasing. And I mean, in terms of research and development, this is the ironic thing. So many global South nations contribute to the research and development, as well as public institutions and, public funding across the global North. But as soon as it's about accessing it, all of a sudden the privatization clause comes up, right? Whilst in South Africa, they did do a trial of around 2,000 health workers who did contribute to AstraZeneca getting some kind of, knowledge about the vaccine. So that's my long run to say that on the one hand, we will push for the waiver, like as much as we can. But of course, most of us, like the Indians, know how difficult it is to live in these extremely neoliberal, profiteering countries that, what is it? How does Biden call white supremacy, you said?
White supremacism I think you said.
We also have our own fair share of white supremacism in South Africa, where we have about 3 white men who have more collective wealth than a lot of the bottom half of the country. And in South Africa, we have an extremely, as many of you know, an extremely unequal society where if we just look at health, 84% of the population, they use public health, right? But this actually, I think it's 60% of health professionals are actually in the private sector. And the private sector only serves 16% of the population. So we have an extremely unequal society where Ramaphosa, the South African government, have done very little and have really bungled things up, honestly speaking,
right,
in the last, year since we discovered the virus, that even if we take a very liberal perspective, there are so many small things around patent laws within the country that are insufficient, the fact that we actually don't have a lot of the production capacity, the fact that if it comes to distribution, I mean, South Africa was aiming at the beginning of the year, they want to vaccinate 67% of their population, which would require them to do 150,000 vaccinations a day, 150,000. And I think the US is just barely touching on, 50,000 a day. It requires a massive infrastructure that the South African neoliberal government has for decades basically been gutting and plundering.
Yeah. I want to bring up a quick visualization here, speaking of this TRIPS waiver, about who supports it and who is against it to raise my next issue here. I mean, many people could probably expect it. So this is a map. I'm sorry, the large TV I have just to my right, so sorry, I'm looking to the right. The red are people who are against waiving intellectual property for the COVID-19 vaccine. The green is a co-sponsor, and the lighter green is supporters. The yellow is undecided. I have to say, Dr. Horne, when I look at a graph or look at a map like this, I mean, it's Europe, the US, Canada, Australia, Japan, Brazil. I mean, there's so many things that could be said about this, but just the fact that, Joe Biden had this huge speech about the moral supremacy of the United States last night, and here we are with the fate of the world, in his hands to some degree over this WTO issue, and this is the real state of the moral, some might say authority degeneracy of the U.S., it seems.
Well, I think that speech last night by Mr. Biden was quite revealing, although not necessarily intentionally. What I mean is that the country that was mentioned repeatedly during the course of his lengthy remarks was the People's Republic of China, and to a certain extent, Russia. And so when we talk about Big Pharma, when we talk about Moderna and Pfizer in particular, they have competition. You have Sputnik V in Russia. You have a Chinese vaccine as well. The Cubans are on the verge of presenting their vaccine similarly. And so when Washington and its allies take this muddle-headed position with regard to intellectual property, with regard to hoarding the vaccines, in some ways, all they're doing is providing a kind of advantage to those countries that they now say are in the crosshairs, as the United States is in the midst of a new Cold War. Recall that during the previous Cold War, there was such pressure on the United States of America that it felt compelled, in order to preserve its fading image, to retreat from the more egregious aspects of US apartheid, meaning Jim Crow. And there's going to be a similar dynamic operating today, it seems to me, ultimately, with regard to this vaccine. If you look at India, for example, where you have this catastrophe, this fiasco, not least because of the policies of Prime Minister Modi, a close ally of Washington, you have not only Russia, a close New Delhi ally, ferrying in various kinds of vaccines and medical supplies, but the People's Republic of China as well, not to mention the fact that it's not just India that is being afflicted so grievously. Inevitably, you see neighbors like Nepal and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka being affected as well. And likewise, you will see Moscow and Beijing seeking to come to the assistance of these particular countries, which obviously will not necessarily be consistent or congruent with this new Cold War. I should also say that Washington has just summoned home many of its personnel and diplomats from New Delhi. Now, who is to say that they are not bringing the virus with them? Who is to say what variant of the virus they may be bringing with them? And so in some ways, this policy with regard to hoarding the vaccine, with regard to keeping a tight control on intellectual property rights, is rather self-defeating in terms of the overall strategy of US imperialism.